Rhett Mabry. I'm president of the Duke Endowment in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a private foundation that provides support across 4 areas: higher education, healthcare, child welfare, and rural churches in North Carolina and South Carolina. My topic today is how government works with philanthropy and vice versa. In terms of how the Duke Endowment was started and how we've evolved over the years, we were founded in 1924 by James Buchanan Duke. And initially, the endowment was conceived as a foundation that provided operating support to organizations in the Carolinas that Mr. Duke selected. So for instance, in higher education, we helped Duke University, Davidson College, Johnson C. Smith University, and Furman University. We also help nonprofit hospitals across North Carolina and South Carolina. We help in the child welfare system in those 2 states, and we help rural United Methodist churches. So initially, the foundation was conceived as an instrument to provide operating support to those named beneficiaries. But over time, we've evolved from funding operating support to capital support to today providing programmatic support. And on those programs, we're trying to affect measurable change, usually in service to trying to change system and redirect dollars so that more public funding goes to more effective programming. There's an old saying that once you've seen a foundation, you've seen a foundation, meaning that all these foundations are different in the way that they express their philanthropy to try to give back, and they all have different purposes. And again, they all have trade-offs. It depends on, I guess, what you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to be a driver of change? And if you're trying to be a driver of change, you probably need to tilt toward the programmatic side and tilt more toward advancing innovation and looking for new approaches. If you're trying to be a sustaining funder and you want to sustain something that's highly effective and continues to produce at a high level, probably an operating foundation or supporting foundation is probably the best thing there. So there are different varieties for the different perspectives that people take. Philanthropy, regardless of the model of philanthropy, they all have challenges and opportunities. There are supporting foundations that supply operating support to established organizations, and that's one type of philanthropy. Its strength would be kind of an enduring funder, and it helps to make those organizations very strong. The limitations may be that money doesn't get redirected to more timely and more pertinent or more relevant issues. There are also foundations that spend a lot of money like we do today programmatically. The good thing there is you can kind of address issues du jour in your specific field. The challenges are twofold, really. One is, how do you sustain that? Because typically programmatic funders are not long-term funders. They're not sustaining funders of these programs that they launch. So how do you sustain it? And then also, how do you avoid being a peripheral program, but actually be a program that's integrated within the existing public systems that occupy most of these spaces? Philanthropy and government work well together when we plan together, when we develop relationships, when we sit down and try to understand what their challenges are, they understand what our goals are, and we try to meld together in some sort of common work to serve our common objectives. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen enough. Philanthropy that doesn't work when trying to work with government is philanthropy that is a bit presumptuous. We'll fund something that we think is effective and clever, and then we kind of have a wish and a hope the government will pick it up and kind of carry it forward. And frankly, that seldom works. So it's critical that if you want to work with government and you're in philanthropy, you've got to develop the critical relationships, the important relationships. You got to build a level of trust, and then you got to be willing to plan together to try to see how you optimize the resources to achieve a shared effect. The challenges with working with government is that government dramatically outsizes all the resources that we have in philanthropy. We're a fairly large foundation. We fund in 2 states, so we're a big fish in a relatively small pond. But even in our situation, government completely overwhelms us with the size of government. Another challenge is, it's as with a lot of big battleships, to use that metaphor, it's hard for government to make changes quickly or dramatically, and there are reasons for that. One reason would be that a lot of government program enjoys some sort of federal match. So for instance, in North Carolina, for every Medicaid dollar, and South Carolina, for every Medicaid dollar that's expended, about 1/3 comes from the states. 2/3 comes from the federal government. So if you're going to start getting state government or local government to spend money differently, they've got to have conversations with federal government about how these matching funds flow as well. There's a lot of inertia, or there are a lot of impediments in place that kind of stifle a learning, growing, ever-changing government service delivery mechanism. There are a couple ways that philanthropy can behave to try to improve better outcomes in partnership with government. One is to kind of show up and do the work, to make the relationships, to establish the trust, to be clear about our strategies and be sincere about trying to understand their strategies and their objectives and their goals and their restrictions and constraints. If you have that foundation, then there are certain tools that are available. One is pay for success contracts or social impact bonds. They're also known as social impact bonds. But these are situations where philanthropy essentially takes the risk. Philanthropy will say, we think we've got a better way to serve this population, and we're willing to invest over a period of time in that alternative approach. In return, if we invest in it, we want to agree with you on what are the outcomes and what are the potential cost savings from those improved outcomes. And we want to quantify that, because what we want to do is enter a contract in with government to say, we'll fund this for 4 to 5 years. We want to track the outcomes on a mutually agreed way. We want to quantify the impact of those outcomes. And if we hit our targets, we either want government to do one of two things. One, repay us, because we put our capital at risk, repay us with some nominal interest return, so principal plus some nominal interest. Or in some cases, like one that we're involved in South Carolina, we don't want you to repay us. Instead, we want you to redirect that money to this program we've been supporting. We're basically trying to create a plausible or feasible pathway for you to make the tough decisions to redirect money and defund something you may be funding that's related, and redirect it in preference to something that we've just proven is more effective. So these pay for success contracts, these social impact bonds, are another tool to kind of create a contractual relationship essentially with government to try to advance change and to affect change and to create a pathway for government to do what it really struggles with, that is redirecting money. The Duke Endowment has had a long history of replicating programs that are proven to be effective. And when I say proven, usually through some randomized control trial research and evaluation. What's become apparent to me lately, though, while I very much support this notion of replicating effective practices, it's become clear to me that the way we think about evidence-based practices has to change. So let me give you an example. 15 years ago, probably most people in any audience had a BlackBerry in their pocket. BlackBerry was the market leader. Today, almost no one has a BlackBerry, and they all have an iPhone. So BlackBerry was at the top of its industry, but it got outperformed through efficiency, and it got outproduced in terms of higher quality product, and it quickly plummeted. In the nonprofit world, particularly with evidence-based programs, once you get a program that's established as an effective program, the tendency is to lock into that program and not make any future innovations, adaptations, or improvement. Not to make it cheaper, more efficient, and less costly. There's no incentive to continue to improve upon the good outcomes that you've already gotten. That creates a bottleneck, really. So once you get something that works, you lock into it instead of trying to continually iterate and get better. And so as we funders embrace evidence-based programs, I think we also need to be able to be willing to embrace investing in change in these evidence-based programs, at least on the periphery, where we can test it with a new innovation to make it more efficient or more effective. I think philanthropy really should be considered as risk capital, because I think there are a lot of tough issues out there that somebody's got to be willing to try and then be willing to measure in a meaningful way, and not just assume that it works, but be willing to measure. And I think that's a role for philanthropy. The reason I hesitate on categorizing all philanthropy as risk capital is that the appetite for risk is not broadly shared always. We all want to succeed in those things that we do. In theory, it's easy to say, well, we funded this and it didn't work out. But when that's your project or you've been spending years on it and it didn't work, it didn't go the way you want, it's tougher to do. So I think in some ways we in philanthropy need to be emboldened to take more risk. Now, the obligation with taking risk is serious measurement, rigorous measurement, so that you can actually learn from what worked and what didn't work. And then you got to be committed to then taking that learning and cycling it back, continuously improving into your grant making, so you keep going better with a different way of giving grants. I say to our staff often that the only way we really fail is not if a grant goes the wrong way or it goes the way we didn't expect it, or even if something was wildly successful. The way we really fail, or the real obligation we have, is to learn from both successes and failure. And if we're committed to learning, which requires measurement, and we're committed to then ingesting that learning so that we do things differently going forward and that we help others to do things differently, then I think philanthropy has served its role. The most important thing to have a policy effect with your grant making to improve outcomes for the populations that you're trying to reach and serve in the communities you're trying to serve. The most important thing to get that policy change, I believe, is to clear two hurdles. One hurdle is you've got to have some rigorous way to prove that you are in fact getting better outcomes. It's not enough just to provide funding for a program that sounds good and everyone's pleased with. You have to go the extra yard and actually measure it and see if, relative to some counterfactual, whether it's some comparison group, pre-post analysis, randomized control study, you've got to figure out some way to understand whether you actually are producing better outcomes. And you got to document that with clarity and with some sort of rigor. Secondly, those outcomes have to have some sort of economic benefit. So if you're producing an outcome like improving third grade reading, for instance, that's a laudable goal. The challenge, if you're going to try to change policy with respect to third grade reading, is that the economic benefit of improving third grade reading is so far out, is so long term, that it may not produce any kind of economic benefit in the short run. Therefore, policy may not change because let's say the intervention costs more. You spend more money to get the better outcomes, but then you don't realize the economic benefit of those outcomes until 10, 15 years later. That's going to be a tough lift for government. So the second hurdle is you've got to produce something that in a relatively short period of time produce an outcome that has some sort of economic consequence. So for instance, in the healthcare side, if you're driving down preterm deliveries, that's going to lead to healthier births, which drives down neonatal intensive care unit admissions, which have a heavy price tag on a per child basis. To move policy, I think you've got to prove that you get better outcomes, and you got to prove that those outcomes actually save government money. That way, you're creating an opportunity for government to think differently about it.